Before electricity shaped what we eat, food was chosen for a very different reason. Not for how fast it could travel, not for how bright it looked under store lights, not for how long it could survive in plastic. Food was selected for how long it could survive on its own. For most of human history, refrigeration did not exist. There were no cold trucks, no freezers, no climate-controlled warehouses. Yet people ate year-round. Cities formed. Armies marched. Civilizations expanded. They did it by relying on foods that were naturally stable. Grains that dried fully and resisted mold. Roots that stored underground for months. Legumes that hardened and slept until needed. Fruits that cured instead of rotted. Durability was not optional. It was survival. When a harvest came in, it wasn't assumed that food would be replaced quickly. It had to last through winter, drought, storms, and uncertainty. Crops that spoiled easily were liabilities. Crops that endured were assets. This shaped what people grew. Certain grains were favored not because they tasted better, but because they could sit untouched for years without losing viability. Some roots were grown specifically because they could be left in the ground until needed, acting as living storage. Others were dried, hung, buried, or sealed in clay. Food was part of the landscape, not a supply chain. And people understood this deeply. Farmers knew which crops tolerated humidity, which resisted insects, which fermented safely instead of rotting, which could survive being forgotten. Those that couldn't were grown sparingly or not at all. Fragility was expensive. In many regions, entire diets were built around foods that could be stored without tools. A household's security wasn't measured by income, but by what remained edible when conditions turned unfavorable. Storage was passive, not powered. Then, slowly, that logic began to change. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, refrigeration emerged. At first, it was rare, expensive, limited to certain industries, but its impact was immediate. Suddenly, food didn't have to survive naturally. It only had to survive until power arrived. This changed what was considered valuable. Crops no longer needed thick skins. They didn't need to dry completely. They didn't need to resist mold for months. They just needed to look good long enough to be transported. As cold storage expanded, fragility became acceptable. Foods that once would have been rejected were now viable as long as they stayed cold. Crops bred for tenderness replaced crops bred for endurance. Shelf life moved from being a property of the plant to a responsibility of infrastructure. And that shift happened quietly. No one announced it as a trade-off. No one framed it as dependence. It was presented as progress. Refrigeration meant variety. It meant convenience. It meant abundance. But it also meant something else. It meant that food now relied on uninterrupted systems. If electricity stopped, food spoiled. If transport slowed, food failed. If storage broke down, losses multiplied. Where once crops carried the burden of survival, now machines did. And so agriculture adjusted its priorities. Plants were selected for softness, size, uniform appearance, and rapid turnover. Not for patience, not for resistance, not for endurance. Foods that could last without help were no longer necessary. Over time, knowledge faded. Fewer people remembered which crops could be stored without intervention. Fewer farmers selected for durability. Fewer systems were designed to function without refrigeration. This wasn't negligence, it was specialization. The food system became incredibly efficient, as long as energy flowed. But efficiency and resilience are not the same thing. One minimizes cost under ideal conditions. The other absorbs disruption. For decades, disruption was rare enough to ignore, until it wasn't. But before that realization, generations grew up never questioning why food spoiled so quickly, why refrigerators were essential, why storage required constant energy. It felt normal. It still does. And that is the foundation of the system we live inside today. A system where food is abundant but fragile, convenient but dependent, available only under the right conditions. In the next part, we'll examine what was lost when durability stopped being a priority and why spoilage became a built-in feature rather than a flaw.
Once refrigeration became common, food stopped being responsible for its own survival. That responsibility shifted outward. Instead of crops designed to endure time, systems were built to manage it. Warehouses, trucks, cooling units, preservatives, packaging, all layered on top of food that no longer needed to last on its own. At first, this looked like progress. Fresh food could travel farther, seasonal limits loosened, markets expanded. But something subtle happened alongside those gains. Durability stopped being rewarded. Plants that once would have been valued for toughness were now considered undesirable. Thick skins were inconvenient. Firm textures were unfashionable. Strong fibers interfered with processing. So breeding goals changed. Instead of asking, how long can this last without help, the question became, how well does this move through the system? This is when fragility quietly became normal. Foods were selected to ripen all at once, soften quickly, and look appealing for a short window. Shelf life was outsourced to refrigeration, not built into the crop itself. From a logistical perspective, this made sense. Uniform products are easier to transport. Predictable spoilage timelines are easier to manage. Fast turnover means faster profit cycles. But uniformity has a cost. When every crop behaves the same way, systems lose flexibility. When food is bred to depend on cold storage, failure becomes catastrophic instead of gradual. Before refrigeration, spoilage was uneven. Some food lasted longer, some failed sooner. Losses were spread out. With refrigeration, everything is held at the edge of decay together. When power is constant, this is invisible. When it is not, the losses are immediate. This dependence reshaped how food was grown, stored, and valued. Foods that cured naturally were replaced by foods that needed cooling. Root cellars disappeared. Dry storage knowledge faded. Crops once left in the ground were harvested early to fit schedules. Even flavor changed. Many durable foods develop taste over time. Drying, curing, and aging concentrate nutrients and complexity. Fragile foods prioritize immediacy instead. Freshness became a marketing term, not a survival strategy. And with that shift, people stopped noticing how short-lived modern food actually is. A vegetable that lasts a week is considered normal. A fruit that spoils in days is expected. Grains that require climate control feel standard. This wasn't always the case. There were foods designed to last months without intervention. Some could be stored for years. Others remained viable in soil, waiting until needed. They weren't exotic, they weren't rare, they were practical. But practicality no longer defined value. Infrastructure did. Once a food system is built around constant cooling, it becomes difficult to imagine alternatives. Storage without electricity feels old-fashioned. Manual methods seem inefficient. Durability appears unnecessary. Until conditions change. As food systems expanded globally, energy demands increased. Cold chains stretched across continents. Storage became centralized. Distribution grew more complex. Each layer added efficiency and vulnerability. When everything works, the system feels invisible. When one link fails, the entire chain is exposed. And the irony is this: the more advanced the system became, the less resilient it grew. Because resilience requires slack. It requires redundancy. It requires food that does not demand constant attention. But modern food was not selected for patience. It was selected for speed. Speed to harvest, speed to market, speed to consumption. Anything that slowed that cycle was discouraged. Durable foods take time. They cure, they rest, they wait. Waiting does not fit quarterly reporting. So these foods became niche. They survived in traditional systems, remote regions, and subsistence contexts. They remained known to a shrinking group of growers and communities who still valued independence, but they were no longer central. The system did not ban them, it simply stopped needing them. And when a system stops needing something, knowledge fades quickly. People forget that food can be stored without power, that crops can be selected for survival instead of speed, that durability is not an accident but a trait. By the time dependence became obvious, it already felt inevitable. Refrigeration wasn't just a tool anymore, it was a requirement. In the final part, we'll look at what happens when that requirement is questioned, and why foods designed to last are quietly returning to relevance.
For a long time, the question was never asked. Food systems assumed uninterrupted energy. They assumed transport would always arrive. They assumed storage would always function. And as long as those assumptions held, durability seemed unnecessary. But slowly, the margins narrowed. Energy costs rose, supply chains stretched thinner, weather patterns grew less predictable, and systems built for speed began encountering friction. Refrigeration, once invisible, became visible again, not as a luxury, but as a dependency. Suddenly, conversations shifted. What happens when storage fails? What happens when transport slows? What happens when food must wait? These were not hypothetical questions anymore. They were logistical ones. Researchers began revisiting crops that could tolerate delay, foods that could be stored without constant intervention, plants that didn't demand precision timing. Not because modern methods failed entirely, but because they lacked buffers. Durable food provides buffers. It buys time. A crop that stores naturally does not require immediate processing. A grain that dries fully does not need climate control. A root that remains viable underground acts as its own storage facility. These traits reduce urgency, and urgency is what fragile systems cannot tolerate. In resilient systems, failure is gradual, losses are distributed, adjustments are possible. In fragile systems, failure is sudden. When refrigeration stops, spoilage accelerates instantly. Entire inventories can be lost at once. There is no fallback. Durable food behaves differently. It fails slowly. It degrades predictably. It gives warning. That difference matters. Modern interest in these foods is not ideological, it is practical. Agricultural researchers now study crops that can be stored with minimal inputs. Development programs focus on reducing post-harvest loss without relying solely on technology. Farmers facing rising costs are reconsidering crops that reduce dependence on infrastructure. And something else has changed. Consumers are noticing. People are asking why food spoils so quickly, why storage requires constant energy, why abundance feels fragile. The answers lead back to breeding priorities. For decades, crops were optimized for appearance, yield, and speed, not longevity. Durability was sacrificed because it was no longer necessary. But necessity is contextual. As conditions change, so do priorities. Foods once considered old-fashioned now look strategic. Storage methods once dismissed now appear efficient. Crops that wait patiently now feel valuable. This does not mean abandoning refrigeration. It means rebalancing. A resilient system does not rely on one solution. It layers options. Cold storage is powerful. So is dry storage. So is living storage in soil. When one fails, others remain. This is how older food systems survived uncertainty, not through perfection, but through diversity. And this is the lesson being rediscovered. The food itself can carry part of the burden. It can be designed to endure time, not just move through it. Durable food shifts responsibility back to biology. It reduces the load on machines. It lowers dependence on uninterrupted power. It widens the margin for error. And margins are what keep systems alive under stress. None of this requires abandoning modern agriculture. It requires remembering that not all progress is linear. Some advances solve immediate problems while creating long-term dependencies. Some older solutions are not obsolete. They are dormant. When conditions align, they return. The foods that do not need refrigeration were never inferior. They were simply unnecessary for a time. That time is changing, and as it does, durability is no longer a liability. It is an asset. The question is no longer whether we can build faster systems. It is whether those systems can wait. Because food that survives without constant attention carries a quiet kind of strength. It does not demand urgency. It does not collapse immediately. It gives people room to adapt. And that may be the most valuable trait of all.